The Eastburns were a happy military family: Gary, Kathryn, and their 3 children, and their lives were about to change for the better, or so they thought. The family had plans to relocate to England, but what was supposed to be a new chapter in their lives turned into an unimaginable nightmare when one man decided to tear the family apart. Today, we'll unravel the horror that took place in the days leading up to Mother's Day, 1985, and how it's still going to this day. Kathryn Eastburn grew up in Kansas City, Missouri, and was no stranger to changes and challenges. She had a quiet life, but she never could have imagined how the future would change her and her family. In the 1970s, Katie would have a life-changing moment at a softball game of all places, where she met Gary Eastburn, a young man who caught her eye and stole her heart. They connected instantly, and their relationship began to blossom. It was love at first sight. By 1975, they were married shortly after Gary enlisted in the U.S. Air Force, which would shape their future. The couple's family grew quickly. In 1979, they welcomed their first daughter, Kara, followed by Erin in 1981, and then, in 1983, Jana completed the family. By the time their 3rd daughter arrived, Gary had achieved the rank of captain in the Air Force, and his military career really took off from there. He was stationed at Pope Air Force Base in Fayetteville, North Carolina, where the Eastburn family settled into a very secure life. With Gary being a military man, things were moving along smoothly for the Eastburns as they prepared for the next big chapter of their lives. In 1985, Gary received an assignment to be stationed in England, which would be the biggest step forward in his career. But it meant that Katie would be left behind to pack up their life and make do for the time being. As Gary began a 10-week officer training course at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama, Katie stayed in Fayetteville with the children, handling the family as a mother of 3 beautiful daughters. There was a lot to get ready for: securing the house, the paperwork, and finding a way to find a new home for their dog, Dixie, because pets weren't allowed to travel to England. Katie put out an ad to find Dixie a new family, which would change the Eastburns' lives forever. What Katie didn't know was that the stranger responding to her ad would play a big role in the horrifying events that were about to unfold. In 1985, as Gary prepared to leave for his officer training at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama, the family faced the reality of their upcoming relocation to England. The logistical details required attention, so there was more to it than just packing their things. They had to go through a ton of paperwork. Gary would be away for weeks, and Katie supported her husband's career and was left to manage the heavy burden of organizing everything for the move. The plan was for the family to reunite in England, but for now, it was just Katie and the 3 young children in Fayetteville. The biggest issue on Katie's mind was dealing with Dixie, the family's dog. Pets weren't allowed on the flight to England, and so Katie had no choice but to find Dixie a new home. It was a difficult decision, but she had to make it. But finding a new home for their 5th family member would bring her face to face with a man who would later be at the center of a horrific crime. While Katie managed these responsibilities, Gary's absence in Alabama was, at this point, the norm in their busy lives. His career had always been a priority, and the family had adjusted to the demands of military life. Gary's promotion to captain had brought them to Fayetteville in the first place, and the upcoming assignment to England was a big step forward. Katie supported her husband's ambitions, but it was clear that their family life was about to change in ways neither of them could have anticipated. she met Timothy Hennis. Hennis was a sergeant in the Army, living in the same Fayetteville area. He had been married to his wife Angela for a few years and had a young daughter, Christina. Hennis, like many young men, was trying to make a name for himself, balancing family life with the demands of his Army duties. His life was ordinary until he responded to Katie's ad about Dixie. What followed next would be a series of small, seemingly innocent encounters that would become tragic in the most unimaginable way. On May 7, 1985, Hennis responded to Katie's ad and came to the Eastburn home to meet Dixie. Katie invited him inside, showing him the dog. He and his wife, Angela, loved dogs, but their current pet, Snowball, a mixed breed, was struggling to adjust to their newborn daughter. Despite their best efforts, Snowball was jealous of the baby, so Hennis and Angela knew they needed a dog that could thrive in a home with a young child. They hoped to find a dog that Christina could grow with and enjoy. Dixie seemed to be the perfect fit. Before he left the Eastburn home, Hennis politely asked to use the restroom, and Katie obliged. And with that, he left Katie's house, unaware that he was about to go on a very dark path. At that moment, Katie couldn't have known that this encounter with Hennis would be one of the last peaceful days of her life. There was nothing to suggest that this harmless interaction would lead to tragedy. Katie had no reason to suspect anything other than that Hennis would simply be another man who was now the proud owner of a new dog. As Hennis left Katie's home with Dixie, the Eastburn family's life continued as planned. Gary was away at his officer training in Alabama, and Katie was busy with preparations for their move. The events that would follow were set in motion by this simple interaction. The evening of May 9th, 1985, began like any other in the Eastburn home. Katie had spent the day taking care of her three young daughters, Kara, Erin, and Jana. But as night fell, the family's lives were changed. By the early morning hours of May 10th, Katie, Erin, and Kara were found brutally murdered. Katie was assaulted and sustained multiple stab wounds. Erin and Kara had their lives cut short and also suffered fatal injuries. Despite the brutality of the crime, the scene seemed undisturbed at first. The front door was locked, but neighbors noticed a pile of newspapers outside the house, indicating that no one had collected them for several days. By the evening of May 10th, Gary started getting concerned because his wife wasn't calling him like she usually would. So, he contacted the Fayetteville Police Department. Officers responded the next day but found no immediate signs of foul play. They left a note for Katie, hoping for a simple explanation. But the family had already been murdered. No one knew what exactly had happened, but on Sunday, May 12th, their neighbor, Army Sergeant Bob Seafelt, returned home to find his wife concerned after bailing out a soldier who had overindulged the previous night.
And rang the doorbell and asked if I had seen anybody over there, and I said no.
She had noticed newspapers piling up on the Eastburn's doorstep. Their car was still in the driveway, and the baby's stroller was at the back door. This was when police discovered Katie, Erin, and Kara lying lifeless, victims of a brutal and senseless attack. Little Jana was alone in her crib, covered in filth and severely dehydrated, but she was the only one who survived. Katie, Erin, and Kara were found brutally murdered. Their throats were slit. Jana was just 22 months old at the time, trapped for 3 agonizing days. So Bob decided to pay a visit and heard what he believed to be an infant crying, but nobody was responding at the front door as he knocked and rang the doorbell. He called the Eastburn's babysitter, Julie Cherniak, who arrived shortly after. She looked through the window and noticed it was baby Jana crying alone in her crib. While her instinct was to immediately enter the house one way or the other, Bob asked her to wait for the police. Officer William Toman was the first to arrive. He retrieved Jana and a stack of diapers after forcing open a window and handed her over to Bob so he could investigate the scene. As he went through the house, the officer discovered the lifeless bodies of Katie and her 3-year-old daughter Erin, and immediately called for backup. A deeper search of the house led to the discovery of 5-year-old Kara, lifeless on her bed. At this point, everybody had the same question on their mind. Why would anyone kill a beautiful young mother and her 2 daughters? Considering that this was a military family, the discovery of the crime had to lead to an intense investigation. On the night of the discovery, the task of piecing together the events was left to detectives Robert Biddle and Jack Watts of the Cumberland County Sheriff's Office. They scoured the Eastburn home for any sign of the killer. Among the clues found were fingerprints and hair samples. A luminol test revealed evidence of a botched cleanup attempt. Someone had tried to scrub the walls and bathroom, but the stains couldn't be hidden. As Gary helped the investigators, he noticed missing items, including Katie's ATM card, $300 in cash, and a piece of paper with her ATM password written on it. It was a janitor named Patrick Cohn who would provide the first breakthrough in the investigation. Cohn approached Robert and Jack, claiming he'd seen a tall white man in jeans and a black member-only jacket leaving the Eastburns' driveway in the early morning hours of May 10th. The man was carrying a garbage bag, and Patrick remembered the car being a white Chevrolet Chevette. His account narrowed the timeline, giving investigators a window for the murders. They took place between 8 p.m. on May 9th and 3 a.m. on May 10th. While investigators were searching the house for clues to identify the killer, a young man named Patrick Cohn came forward with information that would prove to be important for the case. He reported that he had seen a man leaving the house in the early hours of May 10th, the night of the murders. Patrick was walking home from his girlfriend's house around 3:30 a.m., the night of the murder, when he saw the white Chevette parked on the road. A man was walking down the driveway of the Eastburn home, and as he passed him, all he said was, "I'm getting an early start this morning." He then watched him get in his car and drive off. Patrick gave the authorities a detailed description of the man. He was approximately 6'4", with blonde hair peeking out from under a black knit hat. With this new piece of information that would later prove to be vital to solving the triple homicide, police issued a public appeal via television and radio. They requested the man who had answered the Eastburns' classified ad about the dog to contact them. This plea was accompanied by a composite sketch created from Patrick's description of the man he had seen leaving the Eastburn residence. Despite these leads, the investigation stalled as investigators scrambled for more information. But the case started to make sense when investigators realized Hennis had been involved with the Eastburn family shortly before the murders. So, he became a potential suspect. The case drew a lot of media attention, and by May 15th, Hennis walked into the Fayetteville police station and submitted to interrogation with Biddle and Watts. His account was straightforward. He had picked up the Eastburn family dog on May 7th, but had no further contact with Katie, claiming he spoke to her on the phone just once on May 9th to check on Dixie. According to Hennis, after that call, he drove his wife and daughter to his in-laws' house and returned home after refueling his car. But this alibi would soon begin to unravel. Hennis and Angela returned home, believing they had fully cooperated with the investigation. Investigators collected more than just Hennis' testimony. They took blood, saliva, hair, finger, and palm prints from him, and a photo lineup led to an identifying moment when Cohn picked out Hennis as the man he'd seen near the Eastburns' home. Things got even more complicated when it was discovered that Katie's stolen ATM card had been used on the night of May 10th and the morning of May 11th. The total amount withdrawn was $300, which was the exact amount that was stolen from Katie's wallet. Investigators, who were aware of Hennis' history with bad checks and late rent payments, also learned that a female witness had seen a blonde man matching Hennis' description near the ATM shortly after the second transaction, and Hennis' landlord received $300 in overdue rent shortly after the murders, furthering the suspicion that Hennis had financial motives for the crime. By May 1985, Hennis had become the prime suspect, and authorities began to watch his every move. But no physical evidence had yet linked him to the murders. It was all just circumstantial evidence. No one involved, not the police, Gary, or the neighbors, could have expected that this case would occupy courtrooms for the next quarter of a century. There were plenty more inconsistencies with his story. Hennis' alibi about dropping his family off at his in-laws' place was contradicted when his former girlfriend, Nancy Massacre, came forward, claiming he had visited her unexpectedly that same night. Then, there were the black members only. Jacket Hennis had brought to the dry cleaner on May 10th, which was further proof of his link to the crime, and neighbors recalled seeing him burning items in a barrel the morning after the murders. Each new piece of evidence made it harder to ignore the case against him. Later that evening, the police arrived at Hennis' doorstep with an arrest warrant. Hennis immediately called on the services of Beaver, Holt, Richardson, Sternlicht, Burge, and Glazier, one of the most famous law firms in Fayetteville. Jerry Beaver and Billy Richardson, two of the firm's best lawyers, were brought in who were known as the best in the business when it came to criminal defense throughout the state. And they wasted no time. They immediately hired private investigator Bob Nelligar to review the police investigation independently, examine the evidence, and search for any overlooked clues because the authorities were closing in. Hennis eventually got arrested with charges of physical assault and triple homicide. The evidence against him, however, was circumstantial, and prosecutors would need more than just suspicions to secure a conviction. The trial began in 1986, and it was clear that the case wouldn't be easy, especially not against the kind of lawyers Hennis had hired. The prosecution focused on circumstantial evidence, claiming Hennis killed the Eastburn family to cover up allegedly assaulting Katie. The timeline was clear, with the witness who had seen a tall, blonde man leaving the house with a trash bag now identified as Hennis, the culprit. The defense, however, was quick to attack the case. They questioned the accuracy of the eyewitness testimony, attempting to poke holes in the identifications. They even went as far as to recreate the crime scene to demonstrate inconsistencies in the reports. The defense also argued that there was a lack of direct evidence linking Hennis to the crime. Their first idea was to stage a reenactment to prove that Patrick's eyewitness testimony couldn't be right. They brought in a guy who looked like Hennis and went to the Eastburn house that same morning around 3:30 a.m., just like Patrick had seen it, and they brought a camera. But the other guy couldn't see a thing because it's usually very foggy that time of the night. Nelligar kept digging deeper to prove that their client was innocent and found that the hair and fingerprints didn't add up because nothing matched Hennis, including the shoe prints the officers found at the scene, which were too small for a guy his size. Then their forensic expert Stombaugh found a condom wrapper under the dresser that the cops completely missed, This was to prove that the semen sample they found on Mrs. Eastburn could have easily been linked to Gary instead of Hennis. Neligar wrapped things up by talking to Charlotte Kirby, the newspaper lady who didn't give them much, just that it was raining that morning, and she had to bag the papers. Finally, he talked to the neighbors, the Ratkeys, who said they were out walking that morning and didn't see anyone. But a few nights later, they saw the same guy Patrick did. Blonde hair, black beret, a members-only jacket, walking down the street with a garbage bag. But no matter what Hennis' legal team did, the cops weren't convinced because they knew it was Hennis who did it after the evidence and witness reports started piling up. As the trial progressed, the jury was shown horrifying photos of the crime scene to highlight the brutality of the murders. The prosecution's case seemed strong, but without a smoking gun, the verdict was far from guaranteed. After what felt like forever, the jury found him guilty on July 4th, 1986. On one count of first-degree rape and 3 counts of first-degree murder, Hennis received a death sentence in Cumberland County Superior Court in June 1986, but he's been trying to fight the sentencing ever since. Not long after settling into Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina, Tim Hennis got a curious piece of mail, a postcard from someone claiming to be Mr. X, who claimed they did the crime. This was just a ploy for him to try and escape his death sentence, but it didn't work. Hennis' lawyers called it a prank, but they still kept it on file. The prosecution also received a nearly identical postcard, but they also ignored it because the evidence against him was far too much to brush off his sentence. But Hennis' attorneys weren't slouches. They poured hours into appeals, and after more than 2 years on death row, their persistence paid off. The courts overturned his conviction and ordered a retrial, which kicked off on February 27, 1989. The prosecution came prepared with new ammunition, a neighbor named Eliza Peabody. At first, she'd claimed she saw nothing the night of the murders. But now, she was certain she'd seen Hennis leaving the scene. The defense came out swinging, ready to dismantle the prosecution's case. The witnesses were forced into rigorous cross-examinations. Lucille Cook, the ATM lady, was first. At first, she saw no one at the machine, but she suddenly identified Hennis. In court, the defense used bank records and timed how long a minute or two actually felt, exposing major inconsistencies. Patrick, the prosecution's star witness, admitted under pressure that he'd been charged with theft using a stolen ATM card, charges that mysteriously disappeared. His friend, Sean Buckner, testified about a letter Patrick wrote, admitting he didn't really know who he'd seen. The defense's secret weapon was John Raupak, a man who was spotted near the Eastburn home. When he took the stand, he looked exactly like Hennis. Raupak described himself as 6'4", wearing a black member-only jacket and dark pants, matching Patrick's exact description of the man he claimed to see. The case against Hennis crumbled, and he was acquitted in 1989. Many thought this was it. The justice system had failed the Eastburn family, but new DNA evidence in 2007 linked him to the crime scene. Double jeopardy laws prevented a state retrial. So, the military reactivated the retired sergeant to court-martial him. This time, Hennis admitted that he had slept with Katie, with her consent the night of the murders. He claimed that he withheld this detail because he didn't want to hurt the husband's feelings. But the military jury rejected his claims and found him guilty on 3 counts of premeditated murder on April 9, 2010. In 2020, he was put on death row in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, but his conviction and death sentence were upheld. The U.S. Supreme Court rejected his final appeal in 2021. Could Hennessy's determination mean he could be freed one day? We would love to know your thoughts in the comment section.